Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the VIBE Daily Chat Group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily podcast. It is day 18 of our reading, and excited to be back and joined by my friends Collin, Shameeka, and my wife Victoria. So excited to see you guys again. We have 3 more chapters today here in Genesis, so chapters 45, 46, and 47. And so we just want to jump right in. Last time we left off, Judah is making this plea for their brother Benjamin, who has been caught stealing. He didn't actually steal it, but got set up. But whatever the case may be, Judah is trying to make his case for why he should go in Benjamin's place instead to be enslaved. And this moves Joseph, moves him so much that he actually decides to reveal his identity to his brothers. So this is the end of his ruse, the end of his game, and we kind of get where now he has forgiven them. But what jumps out to you guys? Beginning of 45 here, kind of verses 1 through 14 or so, there's the kind of conclusion of this story, and his back and forth with his brothers. Anything that jumps out to you guys in chapter 45?
Yes, I love how Joseph immediately lets them know hey, don't be stressed out, don't have any remorse or resentment or anything, and how he really pointed out what his calling was as to why he was sent to Egypt. We see it in verse 5 and even through 8 where he says it was God that sent me ahead of you, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. And so I just love he pointed that out, and he really boldly stepped into I understand and see God's hand and why this all happened. And that verse 7 particularly, where it talks about a remnant on earth that will bring deliverance, that was that moment that reminded me of Jesus, Jesus being the one that God sent to deliver us. And so I just love that foreshadowing, or even just how those stories were very similar, but just him really sharing with his brothers this is what I was created for. I was called to do this, which you guys may have meant for evil. God used it for, the good of something bigger than what you could imagine or I even thought. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think, obviously this is the crowning moment of kind of this entire piece, and this is the quotable part, right, where we kind of remember that what you all meant for evil, right, God meant for good. And as you said, you see that providence, that purpose for all of what took place in Joseph's life. And I do, I've often heard that it's in the looking back that we can kind of figure that out, right? While he was in prison, he might not have known exactly why he was in prison, and while he was in Potiphar's house, the same. But now that he has seen his brothers and they've gotten to this moment, he's oh, I get it. This is why God brought me through all of this. But I think it points out to even one of the questions we asked earlier this week. I do think he was constantly and consistently aware that God was with him in all of this, and we kind of see that in this summary here.
Yeah.
I love that he did away with everyone else in the room, even the interpreter, and spoke to them in their native language, and just speaking face to face with them, because just it it was real personal. Like it just gave this real personal effect. And then I love how later on, like he does, like he says in verse 11, like I will provide for you. Like he goes straight to like, okay, let's do what everyone knows. This is me and you. We're brothers.
Yeah.
Like, and I love how you pointed out, like he was just like, we're brothers. There's no beef, and now like you can just be safe with me.
Right.
And I loved how he just went real personal with that.
Yeah.
And as we talked about yesterday, it might have taken him a while for that forgiveness to happen and for him to arrive at that place. But when he did, it seems like a really sweet transition.
Yeah. It probably was good too that like they were alone, because it didn't give the other people who could have been in the room a reason to like have resentment or like want to feel some type of way towards his brothers, because we did see that like whenever they found out that Joseph's brothers were there, like they were happy. Like they were just, it was like, okay, cool. And it probably was a testament to like Joseph and his character, how much he has been a help for them. And so, like you said, just having that private moment where it was like, okay, this is just family matters, like this family business, like nobody has to know this, like, and I'm not trying to embarrass you guys or like, you know, put you on blast. Was really good that they were able to have that intimate moment together. Yeah.
I like the instruction that he gives the family when it's time to go to Egypt. He says, never mind about your belongings, because all of this in Egypt will be yours.
Yeah.
And I think about like my life, how many things do I try to hold on to from my past when God has so much more for me in my future. And it just kind of speaks to the favor that God had on Joseph and his family's life. Like because of Joseph's service, they were able to walk into an area that was considered a superpower and get the best of that superpower's land and ask no questions because, you know, of the work that Joseph had done, you know, under Pharaoh's service. And I think about just my lineage, like how many rooms have I been able to step into because of my grandparents and because of my family and the work they put in. And it just kind of just shows, you know, nobody should be discounted in your family or just in the kingdom, because they could be the ones that set you up for your success.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Good. Anything else kind of here in that exchange? They get the instructions, as you said, to go back and to leave their stuff, to come back. They get access to so much more, right, than they would have in their land. Eventually go and tell Jacob, right, and let him know and inform him that his son is actually alive, the son that they lied about and said had died, that they knew did not die, even when they told him that originally. Anything about kind of even Jacob's response or anything of that nature kind of here at the end of 45 that you wanted to touch on?
I think it just shows to the power and the stature that that Joseph like arrived to, that like in verse 22 he gave Benjamin 300 shekels of silver, but he was sold for 20 shekels. Like I think just the contrast there was like, wow, like you gave that to one person, like just your brother, in addition to clothing to the rest of your family, you know, like it just showed like, wow, they might have thought you were worth this, but what God had planned for him and the value that God had on his life and that the wealth that he was able to obtain, it was comparison.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. I would say, like, I do wonder, like, what Joseph was warning them of in 24 when he kind of tells them not to argue. Like, I don't know if it was like he anticipated that they would, you know, kind of just go back to like, oh, this we should have never done, or oh, it was your fault that we here in the first place, whatever.
Sure.
But I back to even kind of how it started in 45. Joseph seemed very intentional about like trying to diffuse the situation of like, there's no reason to be upset about any of this. Like, let's not even rehash it all. Like, this is for our good, and it's for the good of our family and the good of our lineage going forward.
Yeah.
So in the 45, we actually go into 46 here, and Jacob prepares for his return his trip to Egypt, and you know, Joseph is taking good care of him, make sure he's traveling in style, right? He's going first class to Egypt with, plenty of grain and all sorts of stuff to make sure he's taken care of. But from this, we also start to get another chapter of some lineage and things of that nature as well. But anything that jumps out to you guys in 46, as Jacob makes his way to Egypt, and we get kind of insight into his family and his lineage, anything that was particular to you guys here in chapter 46?
I think it was interesting that in verse 2, verse 1 actually, where Israel stopped again in Beersheba at the common place he see him continuously visiting. And he stops and he sacrifices. And then God shows up like in a dream to him. And I love that he's saying, Jacob, Jacob, he's giving him like confirmation, like, go ahead and go to Egypt, because this has been like a forbidden land for them. In their history, like, Egypt has not been the place for their family. Like, Abraham went, it didn't go down well, right? Like, and then he specifically told Isaac not to go in chapter 26 of Genesis. He told him specifically, don't go, which it's possible that Jacob knew this, that they were just not supposed to go to Egypt. And so I love that God kind of gives him this like reconfirmation, like this confirmation of like, it's okay. Like, I know your heart's desire to be with your son. I'm also giving you this blessing that it's okay for you to go.
Yeah. And that he's with them.
And that he'll be with him. Yeah. That Joseph's hand will close your eyes and like, wow.
I think it's significant because, for Jacob, he doesn't know if the brothers are telling the truth. So this could be a death mission for him.
Yeah.
And it's like in the same way that Victoria mentioned that the Lord appears to him in a dream. I'm thinking it's the same way that he appears to him in Bethel. It's like when he's thinking back on the last time that he made a sacrifice to travel like this, he was manipulated by Laban. So it's like the Lord was saying, like, I'm not only going to take you there, but your son that your sons were talking about, I'm literally showing you that he's going to be the one closing your eyes.
Yeah.
So that there's assurance in your travel that you're going to be not manipulated when you get there, but you're going to rest in my promises.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good. Yeah. Random footnote, but I thought it was interesting that they still took some stuff with them, even though to leave some stuff, they still took their cattle and possessions in verse 6, right? So I was like, I guess they didn't take Pharaoh's word there, but so they mount up, and he takes his sons, his grandsons, his daughters and granddaughters, all his offspring that were brought to Egypt. And so then we get, some of that lineage, right? We get to see some more names here and kind of to get an idea of who his sons were. Anything particular in Jacob's family that stuck out to you guys as you were reading through the lineage?
How big their family was. Like, they've grown so much, and like, it even mentioned, like, not even accounting the wives and stuff. Like, it was like 70 in all that went, and just a big growing family. That's one of the things that definitely stuck out to me.
Yeah, I was wondering if they had servants too, like, because it doesn't mention any here, so I was wondering if this was just an account of the nuclear family, right? But I don't really ever hear them speaking of servants that they have, but it's possible they just not mentioned at all. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a lot of people. I'm curious. It's just the way my mind works. Like, I just wonder if, when these 70 people show up, Pharaoh was like, hold up. Like, I didn't know it was this many people. Like, I told you and your sons could come. Like, you invite somebody over, and all of a sudden they bring all their friends. You're like, wait a minute. Like, I didn't invite all them people. But yeah, their family had definitely grown. And, when they get to Egypt, right, like, they give him the best land or some of the best land, right? It's kind of what Pharaoh offers them. And I just think that's, really interesting. They give them this whole place that they can go. Now, it was detestable to the Egyptians, right? Like, the people were, specifically the shepherds. But I thought this land in Goshen was the fact that it had enough to support all of them. Was also just significant that they had enough space for all that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I love this interaction though. Whenever like Joseph and his father Israel finally get to see each other, like man, the weeping that takes place, or just like for Israel, it was like, okay, now I can take my last breath. Like this, like my heart is full. Like this was a moment for him where he was like, okay, I can leave now. Like I was able to see my dearest son, the one that I favored first before anybody else. Which it was such a special moment for them. Yeah.
Yeah, there's this verse, and you know, kind of love you to kind of speak to this a little bit, but in verse 28 it tells that Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to prepare for his arrival, and like, you know, one of the conversations we've been having this week has been just kind of Judah's place in all of this, right? We have this Judah Tamar kind of thing that's kind of inserted in the middle of Joseph's story. Judah playing the part of intercessor kind of constantly and trying to, you know, qualm some of these situations, things of that nature. And then we see him again, Judah's again, right? Like preparing the place for Israel as he gets sent ahead to Joseph. And, you know, we were kind of talking between episodes here. And Collin said something that was kind of interesting, man. I just don't know if you want to share kind of your perspective and thought shift even on how Judah plays a part in this story.
Yeah, so we mentioned a couple days ago about Genesis 38 and how this random story is put in, sandwiched in between Joseph's story with Judah and Tamar. And, you know, it was confusing to me why that story was in between 37 and 39. But then as I continue reading Joseph's story, I kept saying, then reference Judah and his brothers. And it says like Judah led his brothers back home to go meet with Israel. And then Judah and Joseph, they speak with each other. And I'm like, from Genesis 39 all the way to the end of Genesis, we think the story is about Joseph. But could it be that this story was about Judah the whole time? And that Joseph had to go to Egypt to set the foundation so that Judah could usher Israel into Egypt. And so I think like in a larger context, like we see it in the story as just a man Israel, but I think it speaks to like, you know, Israel as a nation and how Judah is considered. Like we know that he produces the Jesus later on in Matthew, but he's like a type scene of like, you know, John the Baptist setting the foundation to usher the presence of Jesus into the world. And in the same way, I kind of see some similarities with Judah. And so like, when we look at this story, I think we're looking at it from the wrong perspective. We're looking at it from the person that sets the foundation. But I think this really is just the introduction in Genesis 38 to Judah and his responsibility to lead Israel into a new place and a new territory.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah, I joking, and then my mind was like blown. I feel like I've been watching a movie the whole time thinking I understood what was happening. And I think that it's so insightful because, again, just the foreshadowing of not just Jesus, but Judah has a significant place in the history of Israel as a whole, right? Like as far as the tribe of Judah and so many other things. So it does seem like that's significant. And I think, again, the question for me is, one, how does Moses know that, right? That's what it feels like. And again, maybe there is prophecy and there's, you know, specific revelation that God has given him. But it does feel like, as this is being authored, it was clear that Judah was going to play a role, a significant role in the history of Israel. Okay, anything else kind of in chapter 46 before we get to 47 here, we'll end today? Yeah, so Pharaoh now welcomes Jacob, right, as well as kind of what happens here, and kind of makes his introduction. Joseph does now, right? Like, hey, Dad, be my boss. No, kind of like a situation here, but yeah. Anything that was interesting to you guys in this encounter before? Just kind of these first few verses of 47.
I think it's interesting to me. We're starting in verse 7 and then again in verse 10. where how many times Jacob blesses Pharaoh.
Mm.
I think it was really interesting because we also know how much weight blessings are. Right?
Yeah.
But then I also do think it's really interesting that in verse 9 he says that he describes his days on earth as few and evil.
Yeah.
In my translation of ESV. And I'm like, wow, when I was really looking back, I was like, wow, like, was it really that bad? And I'm thinking, like, okay, he's been quarreling since the womb, right? With Esau and come out, and there's always tension between Esau and him. And then he goes and gets cheated out by Laban and the whole Laban, Leah, Rachel thing. And then Rachel dies early, and Reuben then sleeps with his concubine, and then Joseph supposedly dies, and
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, like there's a whole lot that's happening in your life that's not favorable. So maybe he was very correct in saying that his days were few and evil, but I think it was just interesting that that's how he describes his life.
Mm. Yeah.
I like in verse 3 how like Pharaoh is inquiring about the brothers' occupations,
Mm-hmm.
and all that is said is your servants are shepherds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like that's what our occupations are supposed to be as Christians.
Mm.
But I think like the significant portion of here is like your servants, like the fact that they come into Egypt. It was a hard decision because they had to choose to submit to Pharaoh's leadership.
Yeah.
Like this is no longer about them anymore. And even though like Pharaoh doesn't necessarily serve the same God, I think it just speaks to their humility, and they're willing to serve, just like Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph was very smart in like telling them to like say that they were shepherds, because he knew that had they said that, like them saying that will allow them to go to a different area like Goshen, to be able to have their family there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. After he introduces his father to his boss and vice versa, then we kind of get this story behind ultimately how everyone ends up enslaved, or some people end up enslaved, and he ends up with all this land. Is this, you see this, the supply, or the demand ultimately exceeded what they kind of had access to. They ran out of things to trade for food, right? They were just kind of going through that, whether it started with silver, and then eventually it was their livestock, and eventually it's, their own lives that they kind of trade for this. But anything that was interesting to you guys in the way that this played out as Joseph continues to barter the food that's available in Egypt with the people of Egypt?
I mean, I thought it was interesting that people were willing to be slaves to not die. And I'm like, oh, so this how this slavery and stuff started. Like, it was the people's idea that they would be slaves to Pharaoh and them, so that they wouldn't die because of the famine. And I don't know if they stated at what point, like what year we're in with this whole famine, but I was like, okay, so this is how we eventually get to Exodus. That definitely stuck out to me.
And I think it's interesting, like, we obviously haven't got to the law yet, but how Joseph is kind of establishing kingdom principles in Egypt, how he's telling the people to give a fifth to Pharaoh and keep the rest for yourself. And like how this is really like introducing tithing. And, I guess the question I had to myself is like, what am I tithing to? Because if I'm not tithing to God, I'm tithing to something.
Yeah.
And like, what pharaohs in my life am I giving my money and my time to if I'm not giving it to God?
Yeah.
Come on, subscriptions.
I'm going to.
That takes a lot of money.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting what you said about the servanthood, that like Joseph, who is an Israelite, made slaves out of the Egyptians, right? Like, he's ruling right now. Like he said, at some point, right, it flips where a new Pharaoh comes and he makes slaves of the Israelites instead. But like right now, what we're seeing is like Joseph's ruling Egypt right now, and I think it's just phenomenal. It's crazy. But then also, I think, like you said, to your point, Collin, even in verse 22, he said these fixed allowances for the priests. I was like, oh, this isn't new. Or even these allotments of land that the priests were able to get, that they didn't like have like buy their land. It was allotted by Pharaoh or whoever was ruling. He said very much parallels with how the Israelites, it was like, okay, the priests and the Levites, they don't work, they serve the temple, so they need an allotment from the people. And so I think the parallel stuck out to me as well.
Yeah. No, that is really good. And I don't know, something you just said, Shameeka, a little earlier, just is now sticking with me, because I do think that it is interesting how much they were willing to give up for food, right? Like, you know, or just to live. And there's so many like ways that can go in my head, right? On just like, you know, again, what are we willing to give up just for this life, like the life that we live right now?
Yeah.
You know, and obviously we live in a different time where we have eternity to look forward to as well. But like, but also just that willingness to devote themselves to something over, you know, over life. And I like, we don't, personally, I feel like we don't have that as much anymore, right? Where I'm just willing to give my life to something, simply because it is my life. Like, it equals life to me. And, you know, I think about in our faith specifically that ought to be, it ought to be all of our testimony, is that like, God, I will give my life to you, literally, and submit myself and enslave myself to you because you have given me life, right? Like, you are life. And so, I don't know, just you sharing that or saying that line, I feel like it just stuck out to me, that they really were. They were willing to give up everything they had to live. Yeah. Like, because they would rather do that than die broke, or die wealthy, right? They'd rather live enslaved than die wealthy, you know, because they were willing to give up anything. Yeah.
And I do like how verse 25 does point out them saying, like, may we find favor in the eyes of the Lord, we will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Like, it is still a prayer of theirs, and their heart is that, like, in the midst of this slavery and bondage, that God would grant us favor. That, you know, whether they would be blessed or there would be some kind of ease with being a slave, they did acknowledge God in that.
Yeah. Good.
And I love the end of 47 where Jacob is making a note that he does not want to be buried in Egypt.
Yeah.
And like, I think it's just kind of shows that your legacy is not just about like what you do when you're alive, but it's like, where I go when I die, right? How will I be remembered? Where will I be remembered? And I think that this verse makes so much sense now to why Abraham was so adamant about purchasing the land from the Ephron Hittite. It's like, I have to purchase this land so that my son's sons can have somewhere that they can call home when in terms of, you know,
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Anything else? 47. Hearts and mind clear. All right. One more day left this week. 3 more chapters left in Genesis, and we would have wrapped an entire book of the Bible. So yeah, we'll see you all tomorrow to wrap up Genesis.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.